Next disease to talk about here for autoimmune diseases of Chapter 6 is myasthenia gravis, often called MG. Myasthenia gravis is a Latin expression that literally means grave muscle weakness, which perfectly describes it because this is autoimmune disease that affects skeletal muscles. People with myasthenia gravis typically wake up feeling fine in the morning, but as the day goes on and by the end of the day, they can feel very weak. Especially if they do repetitive motions that will strain a muscle group, like chopping vegetables. Myasthenia gravis can affect the extraocular muscles, so our eye, which control the movements of the eyes and the eyelids. So we might have things like diplopia, or what we also call ptosis, or the drooping eyelid. It preferentially affects women in their 20s and 30s and then older men in their 60s and 70s. So this is considered a bimodal distribution age. We don't really know why. I'm not going to test you on that question, but it's interesting to know. So you've got your motor neurons that will release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, which then binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the muscle cell membranes. The binding of acetylcholine to its receptor activates a chain reaction in the muscle that ultimately results in muscle contraction. So when we're talking about myasthenia gravis, it's something to do with the acetylcholine. But what happens, though, remember, it's an autoimmune disease, specifically one that categorized as a type 2 hypersensitivity, which causes cytotoxic injury, meaning it results in lysis or death of the host cells. So the host cells are mediated by autoantibodies, which are specific for our own cells or proteins. So in this case, the patient's B cells, myasthenia gravis would be the patient's own B cells, inappropriately make antibodies that bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor on the muscles. Once the acetylcholine receptors are bound by this antibody, they're unable to bind to acetylcholine. So you don't get them to respond and you don't get the contract signal. So anticholine receptor antibodies can also activate the classical pathway of complement. Right? So now we've got a problem. The complement system is that family of those small proteins that work in an enzymatic cascade to fight off bacterial infections. So the activation then of complement causes what? Inflammation and destruction then of those muscle cells and reduces the amount of acetylcholine receptors on the surface. A minority of people with MG produce another type of harmful antibody called muscle-specific receptor tyrosine kinase antibodies, but they similarly lead to the same thing, which is destruction of cells. I'm not testing you on that. In very rare cases, it can actually present as a paraneoplastic syndrome, which means that there's an underlying cancer, like a bronchogenic carcinoma or a thymoma, that can generate this immune response and then generate these antibodies. In some cases, if certain muscles are effective, myasthenic patients can experience myasthenia gravis crisis or myasthenic crisis, which is a life-threatening disease because oftentimes they cannot breathe because the ones that are going to be affected are our respiratory muscles. I'm not asking you questions on these two, I just want you to know, but it is important to remember that myasthenia gravis patients can present as a myasthenic crisis, and we talk about this a lot more, obviously, when we get into decision and management down the road. So, a quick review. Myasthenia gravis is a type 2 hypersensitivity disorder where the body attacks itself, and it begins to produce antibodies that most commonly target nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the surface of our muscle cells. The antibodies block the receptors, which means the signal to contract is not received. And those antibodies also activate the complement pathway, which also then leads to muscle destruction. That is myasthenia gravis in a nutshell.